Thank you. Lady Edith Fergusson. Late in October 1871, the first item of local news in the two Adelaide dailies was the hopeless condition of Lady Edith, young wife of Governor Sir James Fergusson. For several days the colonists kept a death watch. When she died, citizens of every rank accepted Sir James's invitation to pay their last respects at Government House. Colonists crowded into and around St Paul's Church in Pompey Street for the funeral, then followed the mile-long mournful cavalcade, as it was called, along a route lined by great numbers to join the waiting throng at North Road Cemetery. South Australians from all walks of life participated in this funeral, reputedly the largest ever seen in the colony. Lowered flags, closed shops, black drapes in homes and churches, and special sermons were apparent in city and country for a week or more. The whole country wrote a report that was mourned. Much of this mingled fascination and sorrow was typically Victorian. Lady Edith was, too, the First Lady of South Australian society. She was young, 32 when she died, mother of 4, and her delicate health had long been public knowledge. Yet neither respect for authority nor mere sentimentality explain the extraordinarily widespread expressions of grief that followed her death. South Australians were paying tribute to a young titled woman of, quote, great kindness of heart and gentleness of demeanour, who was unremitting in her endeavours to relieve want and sickness. That's from the Southern Argus. Many governors' ladies were content to be official patroness of various charitable institutions, but Lady Fergusson's interests went beyond that. Despite her delicate health and a pregnancy while in the colony, she was in many ways typical of the energetic women philanthropists of Victorian England and their colonial counterparts. She had some organisational talent and in particular a deep piety. She and Sir James associated themselves with some of the most controversial clergy in Adelaide, but her religious convictions were always deeply respected. Her public causes and her private life during less than 3 years in South Australia provide some insight into first churchmanship in Bishop Short's diocese, both its spiritual and its social relationships, secondly the role of women in local charitable institutions, and thirdly the personal and religious life of a remarkable young woman who was briefly head of South Australian society. Sir James's reputation for bravery, administrative ability, interest in social progress, and kindness to his air-shared tenants preceded him to South Australia. South Australia commented the register, South Australians, to a man expect far more from their new governor than they have expected from any other. His swearing-in was attended by Prince Albert, then visiting the colony, and it was predicted to outshine anything in South Australia for another quarter-century. Local Scots were delighted to have a fellow countryman as Queen's representative. For his part, Sir James wasted no time in boasting of his Scottish heritage. Presbyterian church leaders expressed great pleasure in knowing his Kirk allegiance and his generosity to Presbyterian causes. But they were misinformed and overzealous, because Sir James and Lady Edith were members of the Church of England. Initially, however, they were nothing if not discreet. Neither the Presbyterian nor the Anglican clergy gained any inkling of this from the governor's replies to their respective addresses of welcome. Soon after their arrival, the Fergussons attended Trinity's monthly communion service. Their demeanour, Bishop Short's word, pleased Bishop Short. He noted they were serious with no staring about. In the ceaseless jockeying and sporadic verbal battles between denominations in the colony, the Fergussons' confession of faith was a coup for Bishop Short, and he was delighted. He wrote in his diary, "They really seem devout, and the influence of their example, if they are steadfast, will be great. What a responsibility lies upon our church." The Fergussons did not join the Trinity congregation. They sampled most, if not all, the Anglican churches in the city, then joined St Paul's in Poultney Street. Government House fell within St Paul's boundaries, but in deciding to attend worship there, the Fergussons were in fact taking a particular religious stand. St Paul's was no typical Anglican church. Neither its incumbent, the Reverend Alexander Russell, nor the acting incumbent when the Fergussons arrived, the Reverend George Dove, were average Anglican clergymen. St Paul's opened in 1860, so it was the newest of the 4 city Anglican churches. It was attended by those who found St John's location inconvenient, and by those drawn by the personality and churchmanship of the incumbent Russell. Russell was a Scot, educated in a Baptist college and 2 universities in Britain before taking Anglican orders. He served 2 curacies in England before coming to South Australia. One was with Julius Hare, brother-in-law of Frederick Denison Morris, the Christian socialist and broad churchman, whom Russell honoured and esteemed above all men. The other was with William Norris, brother-in-law of Bishop Short. Presumably introduced to Short by Norris, Russell accepted the episcopal invitation to South Australia and arrived in 1854. Russell quickly became Bishop Short's friend and valued advisor. He and the bishop's nephew, the Reverend Charles Marriott of Trinity St Paul's, Port Adelaide and later Christchurch, North Adelaide, won the bishop's confidence and became the core of a small but influential group of clergy in the diocese. They personified the energy and sense of clerical vocation associated with the Anglican revival of the mid-19th century. Much of the news reaching the colony about the revival's adherents, called variously the Tractarians, enthusiasts, the ritualists and the ultra-ritualists, concentrated on secessions to Rome, ritual rites and excesses by both sides. To redress the balance and to reduce the sense of isolation from the church at home, Russell began the Church Chronicle, a remarkably influential Anglican monthly. It concentrated on reporting the renewed vitality evident in church life in England and in the colonies. It devoted considerable space to the growing membership, sober devotion and good works in parishes which in the secular and Protestant press were usually associated with notorious popish practices. Its reports of the local church scene were dominated by the diocese's most active clergy, who in practice were moderate exponents of the Anglican revival. The themes were decency and order, spiritual discipline, such as more observance of church seasons and festivals, and communicant skills, and conscientious attention to the beauty of Anglican liturgy. For example, it advocated improved singing by choristers and congregation and closer adherence to the prayer book rubrics. The prominent clerical names in the Church Chronicle were Russell, Marriott and George Dove, who was the incumbent of St Andrew's, Walkerville, and their locally trained protégés such as Samuel Green of St Peter's Road and later St Paul's, Port Adelaide. They enjoyed the bishop's friendship and support, for Short found them more congenial companions and colleagues than Dean Farrell and Archdeacon Woodcock. Their low churchmanship and enthusiastic endorsement of the common Christianity, which was almost a sacred principle to some South Australian Anglicans and Protestants, annoyed the bishop. He was far more inclined to consult his like-minded friends than their more senior colleagues. When Woodcock and Farrell died in 1868 and 1869 respectively, Short quickly replaced them with Marriott, his archdeacon, Russell, his dean, and raised George Dove, their close friend, to a canonry. These appointments reveal the bishop's own churchmanship, for Russell and Dove in particular were associated with advanced or extreme practices. Russell was a sober churchman who supported the moderate aspects of the Anglican revival and who deplored party strife. Dove, on the other hand, was rather less sober and discreet, and admitted, he said, a very great deal of sympathy with ritualism. At St Andrew's, Walkerville, Dove had introduced, and introduced is always a favourite word of ritualist, Dove had introduced daily matins and evening songs, weekly communion and observance of feast days and seasons. In 1868 he also introduced some furnishings of questionable legality, such as candles on the altar for decoration and flower pots. His reputation for advanced theology and ceremonial were well known and growing. Dove was acting incumbent of St Paul's in Pulteney Street in 1868 to 69 while Russell visited England. He quickly introduced daily prayers and weekly communion there to Russell's delight. Not all parishioners, however, welcomed the innovation. Bishop Short noticed a definite drop in the size of the congregation in 1869. He was quickly informed that sermons by Dove and the Reverend Robert Webb, who was the bishop's missionary chaplain, were the cause. Several months later, the annual synod was dominated by a debate on ritualist practices in the colony. Names were awkwardly avoided most of the time, but it was scarcely a secret that Dove, Webb and Green were singled out as ritualists. Undoubtedly they rejoiced in the label. Lest you think that Lady Edith has been forgotten, during these months, the autumn of 1869, the Fergussons joined St Paul's. Russell was still in England and they may have met him there. More likely than not, though, Dove drew them to St Paul's. Dove and the Fergussons had a mutual friend in the aristocratic Lady Charlotte Bacon. Lady Bacon, who appeared in the viceregal party from the day the Fergussons arrived, was visiting her children in the colony. Her son-in-law, Charles Burney Young, was a prominent local Anglican, parishioner of St Andrew's, Walkerville, and Dove's staunch defender against ritualist attacks in the synod. The Doves and the Shorts were among the Fergussons' first personal friends in the colony. I might add in parenthesis that Bishop Short had been at Christchurch, Oxford at the same time as Lady Edith's father in the late 1820s, so whether there was any kind of connection there, I'm not sure. The Fergussons were undeterred by the controversy surrounding Dove and his two parishes. They attended both St Paul's and St Andrew's. They proved also to be active rather than passive parishioners and offered two contributions, the ceremonial on the one hand and good works on the other. Soon after the Fergussons' arrival and the stormy synod session about unfamiliar, possibly popish practices in local churches, St Paul's Church introduced one such practice, a surplice choir. What was described in the press as Lady Edith's choir, of gentlemen and boys robed in surplices, began to sing the daily service at St Paul's, accompanied by Lady Edith herself on the harmonium. The vice-regal couple presumably donated the surplices and the printed music. It was the first surplice choir in the diocese, and it was hardly an innocuous gift in the sensitive climate of 1869. In England, surplice choirs by then had lost most of their party or ritualist taint, and by 1869, 1 in 5 London churches had one. In South Australia, however, the sight of one could arouse fear and wrath in some Anglican and Protestant circles. Russell had written in 1868 to his parishioners from England of his pleasure in seeing village choirs in the Lichfield diocese whose boys were, quote, decently habited in surplices. On his return, he went to great length to explain the innovation at St Paul's, emphasising the symbolism of the chorister's garb and the sober order of the procession, which he said was far preferable to choir members, quote, straggling in at different times and without serious preparation of heart for what they have to do. He appealed to parishioners to wait until, quote, the first novelty had passed away. He wrote extensively on the subject in the parish magazine and urged a sense of perspective. Anyone who said, he said, who in England considered the surplice choir a sign of ritualism would be heartily laughed at. The matter simmered for a year, and then the controversy surfaced in the columns of the Protestant Advocate. The Protestant Advocate purported to preach, quote, freedom from the mummeries of popery and ritualism, and to unmask Anglican traitors who enticed churchmen blindfold into the net of the Romish fowler. Russell was a favourite target, as was Dove Green. Several aggrieved St Paul's parishioners complained of unacceptable ritualist novelty. The procession of surplice choirs, predicted one, would produce a secession which cannot be recovered. In fact, the congregation of St Paul's, as well as the offertory, were considerably larger in 1870 than they had been in 1868-69. The 1871 synod, a debate occurred about the legality of the service Russell had used to induct his choristers, a service for which he had omitted to get the bishop's permission. Charles Young, close friend of the Fergussons, had defended Dove in the 1869 synod. Now it was the turn of John Fergusson, the governor's young brother come aide-de-camp, synod representative of St Peter's Road and parishioner of St Paul's in Pulteney Street, to defend Russell. He accused local churchmen of confusing zeal with imaginary ritualism. He was partly informed by the Reverend George Farr that the diocese had had, quote, a great deal of trouble with reference to church discipline, and matters of this kind were not so frivolous as Fergusson thought. The bishop mildly reproved Russell of his dean, and then dismissed the matter as a pop gun of very small effect. The Adelaide correspondent of the Border Watch, the Mount Gambier paper, tried to keep the matter alive in his column. He accused Russell of accepting these innovations only after, quote, ascertaining the proclivities of certain exalted personages who had come to South Australia during his absence, end of quote, an obvious reference to the vice-regal couple. Russell pointed out that the innovations Dove had made in his absence had his enthusiastic approval well before the arrival of the unnamed important parishioners. In any case, he continued, those parishioners had been, quote, expected to attach themselves to quite a different communion. Ritualist controversies in other parishes, such as St Luke's in Whitmore Square, drew the anti-ritualists' attention from 1871. Surplice choirs, however, remained conspicuous by their absence. The cathedral choir was only the second or third surplice choir in the diocese when services began in the cathedral in 1877. It's worth noting in passing that the repertoire of Lady Edith's choir attracted less attention than the chorister's garb, but that some of it at least was much more of a party badge than the surplices were. The repertoire included a very generous proportion of Gregorian chant, which in 1870 was far more a sign of extreme ritualism than the surplice choirs. The rest bordered on the almost out of fashion as far as English parish music was concerned. Contemporary English composers such as Monk, Goss and Dice were represented, although poorly, but others, such as Samuel Sebastian Wesley and Frederick Ouseley, did not appear in the repertoire at all. Like most broad churchmen, Russell seemed to have frowned on congregational participation, or at least emphasised the separateness of choir and congregation. The choir's garb and procession, the rehearsals and the induction, and even the annual picnic for the choir, which was held at Government House Farm, courtesy of Sir James Fergusson, all stressed this. The choir's role was closer to the clergyman's than to the congregation, and Lady Edith made a major contribution to that ambience. A quote from George Duff's funeral sermon about it: "She considered it no trouble to teach children how they could assist in the service. It was through her instrumentality that the choir was organised and clad in the appropriate raiment. She tried in her personal kindness to lead each member of the choir to set about his work with the reverence she always manifested herself." Good works were as distinctive a feature of St Paul's as the daily services, Gregorian chant and processing surface choir. Lady Fergusson was as committed to the parish's charitable causes as she was to its worship. The commitment to social action dated from St Paul's beginnings in 1860. Russell's list of activities during the first year mentioned, quote, tract distribution, district visitation, the weekday services, private meetings for Bible reading and conversation, the Sunday school work, the institution of a parochial institute with monthly popular lectures, etc., a parochial institution for Christian work under a vow of total abstinence, the establishment of an evening communion once a month, etc. End of quote. The energy behind this impressive list of religious and charitable undertakings was the indefatigable Russell. He deplored the Church of England's reputation as the church of the respectable and comfortably off. By precept and example, he endeavoured to convince Anglican clergy and laity that the Church's special mission was to the outcasts of society, the destitute and unemployed. He reminded parishioners with, quote, superior talents or superior advantages that the Scripture enjoined them to use their gifts for the good of others. He rejoiced in the broad spectrum of social and economic backgrounds from which his parishioners came, but especially in the attendance of, quote, the trading and working classes, whom Anglicans assumed were by rights dissenters, end of quote. He was well known for his support of working men's causes, such as associations for mutual help and improvement, early shop closing, cooperation between capital and labour, and in, quote, exceptional circumstances, unquote, such as the depression of the late 1860s, government relief. Russell was greatly impressed with the extent of what he called quiet evangelistic benevolent work he saw in English parishes in 1868-69. Much of it, he believed, could be emulated in South Australia, particularly, quote, mission churches, mission clergy, lay readers, parochial mission women, and brotherhoods and sisterhoods. Returning to St Paul's, on his first Sunday back, he called on the congregation for assistance, and Lady Fergusson was one of those who responded. As an ordinary parishioner, Lady Fergusson attended the newly formed Association for Women's Work at St Paul's. Its purposes included visiting the sick and poor, providing religious instruction to domestic servants, teaching children of the poor, establishing a benevolent fund for medical assistance to the destitute ill, and collection of money for missionary and other purposes such as church furnishings. 40 women joined the association in 1870, among them Lady Fergusson. The complementary organisation, the St Paul's Association for Men's Work, also appeared in 1870. Its work embracing, quote, prayer meetings, choral services, a day school, a night school, cottage lectures, hospital ward visiting and fundraising. The association recruited Lady Fergusson for one of its activities, the special mission services based on those Russell had seen in England. They were held in the old Congregational Chapel in Ebenezer Street in the East End Market. Lady Fergusson trained another choir to lead the music of these services. The worship was intended for those who were not ordinary churchgoers, said Russell, and the music was, quote, not elaborate, but a natural and joyful service in which all may join. Whether or not Lady Fergusson attended the missionary services is unclear, but she, quote, did what she could as regards the service of song. Ex officio, and also because of her religious and social convictions, Lady Fergusson was patroness of several predominantly Anglican charities, such as the Female Refuge, founded in 1856, the Orphan Home, 1860, and the Servants and Convalescents Home, 1862. She was a member of the Ladies' Committee of the Refuge, which looked after the refuge's domestic arrangements, while the Men's Committee managed the quote-unquote public affairs. By contrast, both the orphan and the servants' homes were run entirely by committees of ladies. The servants' home provided lodgings for respectable female servants with references who were prevented by illness or some other cause beyond their control from working. The Ladies' Committee managed the home, raised the funds, and prepared a servants' registry for prospective employers. In Lady Fergusson's time, it also ran a highly successful soup kitchen, to the inner city poor in the winter of 1870. Sir James and Russell were also involved in this project. 4,000 quarts of, quote, good and strong meat soup at a penny a quart were distributed in 5 months. The servants' home itself lived a hand-to-mouth existence in the late 1860s and 1870s. The Ladies' Committee moved its location several times, attempting to reconcile convenience and economy. One critic in the press suggested that despite the ladies' best intentions and their energy, their mismanagement had in fact reduced the home to little more than a reservoir of servants for their own needs and those of their friends. Needless to say, chivalrous defenders rushed to the ladies' rescue. Lady Fergusson, like many women philanthropists of her time, devoted herself to the Christian training of servants and potential servants. The motives behind such a cause were a pragmatic, powerful combination of piety, talent, social conditioning and self-interest. Sir James himself dwelt on the self-interest when commending the servants' home to the colonists at its annual meeting in 1870. He said, "It was as much to the advantage of the community as to those who were inmates," it being the home, applause in brackets. In large measure, they depended upon their domestic servants. They knew the advantage and comfort of having good ones, but there was no hope of that comfort continuing unless they were respectable, and it was a positive necessity that they should be cared for. Self-interest, however, could be softened by piety. Lady Fergusson's dying thoughts were with the women of these homes. She prayed in particular that the servants' home might be, quote, kept upon a proper footing to save the girls from becoming bad. She was also a regular visitor among the Magdalens at the female refuge. As Dove said in his funeral sermon, pure in heart she could feel for her fallen sisters and was never weary of asserting herself on their behalf, of seeking to reclaim them and to make them entertain cheerful hopes with respect to the future. Women and children was Lady Fergusson's main charitable interest, but not her only one. She and St James, not St James, she and Sir James also supported undertakings to extend pastoral care, always Anglican pastoral care, in city and country. They attended bazaars and concerts in aid of various Anglican building projects, usually those for high church parishes. They donated, quote-unquote, pleasant and devotional books to the telegraph parties in the Northern Territory. Sir James often lent his yacht to Anglican missionary clergymen for their pastoral tours in various parts of the colony, from the southeast to York's Peninsula. In fact, Sir James often arranged official and private visits to different areas of the colony around pastoral visits by the bishop and other clerical friends. Port Elliot, for example, enjoyed a combined viceregal and episcopal visit early in 1870, as the Fergussons, the Shorts and the Doves sought to escape Adelaide's summer heat. The viceregal couple and clergy were all involved in the opening ceremonies of several Anglican churches from Walkerville to Port Elliot, and in between dined with each other regularly. Short made an episcopal tour of the southeast early in 1871, visiting his married daughter there, and then the Fergussons, who sojourned there in the summer at Rome. He returned to Adelaide with Lady Fergusson on Sir James's yacht. A small Anglican coterie formed around the Fergussons at Rome. The new Anglican incumbent at St Peter's there was Henry Howard, who had been Duff's assistant at St Paul's in Pulteney Street when the Fergussons joined the controversial congregation. Howard opened a school at Rome, offering, quote, good English education combined with religious teaching of the Church of England. He appointed a lady teacher, and in addition, this is a quote from the newspaper, Lady Edith or other members of the viceregal household gave instructions in singing and other accomplishments daily. With Bishop Short's family nearby, Henry Howard was rector, and Lady Caroline Bacon as house guest, the Fergussons found Karratha House a home from home, spiritually as well as socially. The Fergussons invited Anglican clergy to most of their functions at Government House. Bishop Short, Archdeacon Marriott and their wives were frequent guests at Lady Fergusson's small private dinners and parties. She had as well several Presbyterian and Roman Catholic clergy among her favourite guests. All brands of Anglican churchmanship were reflected among the clergy invited, but members of the so-called advanced party were usually prominent, such as the Doves, the Webbs, the Morses and the Greens. Samuel Green, the young and popular, rather controversial incumbent of St Paul's at Port Adelaide, became a close personal friend of Lady Fergusson's, as did the Bishop, Dove and Russell. Green spent much time with her in the last stages of her illness in October 1871, and he was profoundly moved by the experience. The Bishop, Dove and Russell preached funeral sermons which concentrated on her good works. Green, on the other hand, gave a highly personal account of her spiritual life. He spoke of her, quote, reverently, tenderly and lovingly, almost with awe. She lived, he said, a, quote, higher spiritual life than most Christians, as her good works and the attention to the interests of her soul indicated. An overflowing congregation heard his emotional address, which, Green said, he gave, quote, not to satisfy curiosity, but to present the edifying sight for the benefit of those who survived. The Register reporter was so impressed he hoped it would be published as a pamphlet. Green's sermon appears not to have been published in full. It caused a stir in extreme Protestant circles, however. The Protestant Advocate accused Green of preaching prayers for the dead and the sacrifice of the Mass in it, and outraged, the paper shouted, quote, a heresy so crass that the bare thought of it will be enough to sleep the hearts of 9/10 of those who read it with a sense of the deep humiliation and to bring the burning blush of shame to their averted faces. Tact and respect, however, prevented the matter from being pursued. It is unfortunate that Green's sermon exists only in summary. It would have given an indication of the theology of Adelaide's advanced Anglican clergy. More importantly here, however, it would have provided insight into the rich spiritual life of an unusual woman. Instead, one must depend on indirect evidence, her good works and her active support of a particular brand of churchmanship and the testimony of friends and admirers. Bishop Chalk found her a woman of remarkable spiritual strength, pious but not puritanical, concentrating on the state of her soul but neither disdaining nor fearing culture and refinement. She was, he said, rich toward him, rich in good works, unobtrusive but discerning in her charity, having that princely innocence of heart which could enjoy without spiritual detriment the pleasures of social life. Lady Fergusson expended little of her limited store of energy on public appearances, vice-regal tours and state occasions, although when health permitted, she did attend the theatre and concerts, as well as 1 or 2 race meetings and the opening of Parliament. By and large, however, she conserved her resources for spiritual exercise and good works. One country newspaper commended her example as one well worthy of being followed by other persons of position in Wilson Colony. Samuel Green, on the other hand, captured a good part of why thousands of colonists attended her funeral and mourned her so. From her life and death, he said, virtue has gone out. Thank you.